Okay, so this is our third lecture in the skeletal muscle, and so we're still, these pages are not like cut and dried where they are in your notebook, so you just want to kind of follow along with maybe the outline that you have. And I break up the notebook on the table of contents just kind of in an arbitrary way according to each section ending with a quick check. So if your pages don't line up perfectly with what's on the table of contents, it's not a problem. So today we're going to talk about the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle, the actual structural unit of skeletal muscle, and then some gross anatomy structures. So what's the difference between microscopic and gross? Gross is your overall structure, things you might be able to see with the naked eye. Microscopic, obviously, you're going to need to have a microscope in order to see those things. So we're going to focus right now first on the microscopic structure. And you've already looked at muscle cells in pictures of the microscopic view. You've seen drawings of the microscopic view, and you've drawn the microscopic view. Okay? First of all, you need to understand that anytime I refer to a muscle fiber, I'm really talking about a muscle cell. So muscles have a set of their own terminology that's different than the generic just saying muscle cell. So you're going to hear me use words, and I'll always tell you kind of what it's equivalent to. Like sarcoplasmic reticulum is the endoplasmic reticulum just in a muscle cell, for example. Okay, so don't want you to be too intimidated. So muscle cells or fibers are bundled together and gathered together into groups. So the muscle cells are formed into groups called bundles. Okay, so you guys have all had the experience of eating shredded beef or shredded chicken, right? In order to shred meat like that, you have to cook it at a lower temperature for a long period of time. And what that accomplishes is the breakdown of the connective tissue that holds these bundles of muscle cells together. And that's what makes it shred. It breaks down the fascia or the connective tissue, and then the bundles shred away from each other. So when you shred the meat and you get those individual little, like, almost looks like hairs, those are bundles of muscle fibers or bundles of muscle cells. That's what it's shredding. Okay? So if you had, a nice roast and you didn't cut it into pieces, it would shred and you'd get one long fiber, because muscle cells can be really, really, really long. Within each fiber, and again, remember, fiber, it means cell. Within each muscle cell, there are thick filaments and thin filaments. And so when we say filaments, you need to think protein. There are thicker proteins and thinner proteins, okay? Thick proteins and thin proteins. The thick proteins are called myosin, and the thin proteins are called actin. Now, I have always had a really hard time remembering which one's the thick one and which one's the thin one. And so, there's a couple ways that you can remember this. It seems the easiest to remember, for me to remember, actin sounds thin. Actin is the thin filament. Okay? So, myosin is the thick filament. And this will be important because the actin slides over the myosin. Okay? So actin is thin. Myosin is thick. And again, I really, really recommend you don't write things down in complete sentences, but instead you use bullet points and equal signs. So I would say thick myofilament equals myosin. Thin myofilament equals actin. I wouldn't write parentheses composed of blah, blah, blah. Okay? Yeah. Abbreviate it, because your brain can remember things better when it's short and sweet. And pictures are even better than words. So draw pictures wherever you can. So when you go back and you review through your notes, like I know you do, because you need to do your Cornell notes, you need to be able to write your questions and your summaries. You need to draw yourself pictures to prompt your memory, to defeat that curve of forgetting. Okay. So So these units of the thick and the thin filaments overlapping over each other makes what's called a sarcomere. And the sarcomere is the actual unit of contraction. Muscles can only do one thing, and that is to contract or to shorten. And the lines that show you the unit, what actually is a unit, a sarcomere, are called Z lines. And so there is a protein on either side. So I'm making a thick filament. You drew something like this in your notes, didn't you? Yes. Okay. So between this point and this point, those are the Z lines. And this whole thing here is the sarcomere. And so contraction occurs in a muscle when the Z lines actually get closer to each other. Okay? And they get closer to each other. Okay? So when those Z lines get closer to each other, then the muscle is going to shorten as a whole. Imagine you have all these different sarcomeres. Okay? You have all of these different sarcomeres lined up, right? And if each sarcomere shortens in width, then the overall muscle is going to shorten in width. And that's all that muscles can do, okay, is to shorten. Okay, so here are some that are there for you. And so can you see how these filaments here are thicker in size? So the thick ones are the, which ones? Myosin. And the thin filaments, the blue, are the actin filaments. And so when the myosin connects to the actin, it'll pull on it and cause this Z line to come in towards the middle, towards its I band or H band. And this side comes in by connections that are made. It's called the power stroke. And then both of the Z lines here on either side get closer to each other, and that is what causes muscle shortening. So this is just an overall explanation of what happens, and then you're going to see step by step what causes that to happen. It has to do with calcium being released inside of the cell. Okay? Now, if you want to see this PowerPoint again, you don't even have to listen to me. You can hit the mute button and not listen to me at all and just do your drawings and copy your notes. Okay? You don't have to listen to me. And you can fast forward and stop it and do whatever you want. All right. So this model for how muscles contract is called the sliding filament model. Filament, because we're talking about actin and myosin, we're calling them myofilaments. And what action are we looking at? We're looking at a sliding action, where the actin slides over the myosin. And it's a model. This is really, though, they've used electron micrographs. They've seen what proteins are involved here. And they've actually seen what it looks like in a relaxed state versus a contracted state. In the contracted state, you see more areas of overlapping. In the relaxed state, those Z bands are farther apart. Okay? So in order for contraction to occur, the thick and the thin filaments slide past each other. And this requires calcium and ATP. All right. See, there's students talking, so it actually proves that I'm in my classroom. All right, so tell me, you guys, if calcium is required for muscle contraction, how are we going to get the calcium that we need? How are we going to get the calcium that we need in order for our muscles to contract? How are we going to get the calcium that we need in order to keep our muscles contracting? Because if your muscles stop contracting, you die. You understand that, right? Your heart is a muscle.
Through milk and sun.
Okay, so calcium supplements. Well, how about we get it through a healthy diet, right? A healthy diet, drinking milk. We synthesize vitamin D with sunlight, okay? If we don't have a healthy diet, if we don't take calcium supplements, if we don't get the calcium that we need, how does our body ensure that we have the calcium we need for muscle contraction? It pulls it from our bones. Okay, so our bones are a natural reservoir of calcium. What is, though, the cost of pulling calcium out of your bones? Makes your bones weak. So it's imperative that we get enough calcium through a healthy diet, not just drinking milk. There are other sources of calcium. You guys, we always underestimate how important our leafy vegetables, our leafy green vegetables are. But these are our sources of all of these essential, really important nutrients that we need to keep our body healthy and going. And if you aren't going to eat those, then you have to supplement with vitamins. You have to take supplements to make sure that you get enough. Otherwise, you cannot build healthy bone and muscle if you don't have enough protein, if you don't have enough calcium, potassium, phosphorus, okay? So you don't underestimate. You also need ATP. And how do we make ATP in cells? This goes way back to biology. By the what? The mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, I heard two people chime in. Mitochondria and the powerhouse of the cell. We make ATP in the mitochondria by burning what molecule? What's the fuel for our cells? The fuel source for the mitochondria is a sugar called glucose. Okay? So glucose is the gasoline for the cell. It makes the cell go. The currency that glucose gets turned into, though, is called ATP. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we proceed on. Okay? We're going to now talk a little bit. We're going to go from the gross anatomy of muscle down to the microscopic anatomy of a muscle. So when we look at a muscle as a whole, okay, the muscle as a whole, that's the muscle connected to the bone by a tendon. The muscle, each muscle has multiple bundles in it. And if we open up one of these bundles, okay, there's a bundle. This is what you would get when you shred your beef. Okay, within each bundle is a muscle fiber, and that is a cell, a muscle cell. Within a muscle cell, you see these banding patterns. Can you see it here on the little diagram? Okay, that's what we see as the striations of the muscle cells. When we're looking at those striations, and we look at the striations from one thin line to the next thin line, okay, those represent the Z lines. And the alternating areas of dark and light banding are caused by the degree of overlap of the actin and the myosin. Where the actin and the myosin overlap, that is the thicker area. And where there is no overlapping, that is an area where it's lighter. And so the overlapping, and I love your face, Madeline, because I always thought that was really cool. Like, wow, that's why it has stripes. Because there are these highly organized systems of proteins lined up inside of that muscle cell. And that gives it that banding. So when a muscle cell contracts, those bands get closer, those thick bands get closer together. And then here we have below that a diagram showing a relaxed sarcomere and then a contracted sarcomere and then a maximally contracted sarcomere where you have the greatest degree of overlap. Okay, here is another diagram. Take a look at this. because you don't have this diagram in your textbook. Okay, so this is a nicer up close view, and I want you to see that each muscle has a wrapping on the outside of it called the epimysium. Okay, so this helps you understand these terms because they will appear on your test. Okay, each bundle is wrapped in the perimysium, so this wraps the bundle. And remember, a bundle is a bunch of cells. So each one of these things here is a muscle cell, okay? So a bundle of muscle cells is called a fascicle. So a fascicle is a bundle and it's wrapped with a perimysium. So I really highly recommend that if you aren't trying to write this down right now, that you pause the video and you go back and you look at it and you make sure that you have all of these terms and you understand them. Okay? And then each muscle cell is wrapped in the endomysium. Okay? So I'll say muscle fiber because we know that muscle fiber means muscle cell, right? And so here is a muscle fiber, which is the muscle cell. So this gives you kind of the gross anatomy of a muscle. I find that drawing these things really solidifies it in my head. And the next step that's even better than drawing it is explaining it and talking someone through it. When you teach something to someone, it really, really solidifies it in your head. Okay, even if it's just your dog or your cat.
Sometimes during math, never mind, that's embarrassing.
All right, so there is your gross anatomy of the muscle. Make sure you're familiar with those terms: epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, and know, like, smaller to bigger, which one wraps the actual cell, which one wraps the whole muscle. All right, moving on. This diagram does kind of what we've already talked about. It's just taking us all in one picture, in a counterclockwise manner, going from largest to smallest, just going, taking out a muscle bundle, then pulling out a fascicle, then pulling out a fiber from the fascicle. It helps you just understand the overall organization of the muscle. And then here we have a microscopic picture of what causes the striations, the stripes in skeletal muscle. Okay, muscle fatigue. So fatigue is defined as the reduced strength of a muscle. What did we do in class that showed muscle fatigue? The jumping jacks. We didn't do jumping jacks until we got fatigued. We did the clothespin, right? Yeah. Okay, how many of you on your graph maybe had a graph that did, over your trials, you started off and you did like maybe this many in the first, I gotta make a dot, and then you actually made more and more, and then it started going down. Okay, so the reason why you got this peak and then this decline is because you did your first trial, and this would be defined as number of clicks. Okay, and this is your trial. Okay, and at first you did a certain number of trials, and then you said to yourself the second time, oh man, I gotta beat that number. I can do it. And so you worked a little bit harder. And the second time, oh, I bet you I could do more. And the third time you did more. And then you really, really pushed your muscle. Then you got muscle fatigue happening. Okay? So that's why you got that increase and then decrease. This is a hard thing because some of you maybe got like that. Because maybe one time you were really tired and then, you dug deep and you did more and then you did less. And okay, so your data can be a little bit funky there. Okay, what causes fatigue? When you repeatedly stimulate a muscle and you don't allow it to rest in between. Okay, so in order to fatigue a muscle, we have to work out that muscle until we use up all of the ATP that's stored inside of the muscle. And again, what do we need in order to make ATP? We need glucose, and to make the most ATP, what do we need?
Water, energy. No, ATP is energy.
What? Oxygen. Woo.
That's right.
Okay, so when you are vigorously working out, your muscles are going to need more glucose, which isn't a problem to get glucose to your muscles. And muscles are going to need more oxygen. How is your body going to supply your muscles with the oxygen that it needs? By breathing. Does your breathing rate stay the same when you're exercising vigorously? No. What happens to your heart rate? It increases. Why? Blah, I hear mumble, mumble, mumble. Why? Why would your heart rate need to increase? Because you're working harder and to get more blood to the muscles, to carry more oxygen to the muscles. What happens to your breathing rate?
It increases.
It increases. Why? To exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. But even that isn't enough when your muscles fatigue. Okay? Even that isn't enough. If you are really pushing your muscles hard enough, you go into a type of anaerobic respiration. Okay? So aerobic respiration is with oxygen. And we get somewhere near 38 ATP gross from one glucose getting broken down. Okay, one glucose equals 38 ATP. Anaerobic respiration is the type of respiration without oxygen, and one glucose only gives us 2 ATP. That's not enough. So once we switch from aerobic respiration into anaerobic respiration and lactic acid starts to build up, our muscles are going to poop out. And the result of that is the burning that you feel in your muscles, the fatiguing of the muscles, because they just literally cannot contract any longer. There is no ATP available. And then the next day, until your body breaks down that lactic acid, you are going to feel sore. Okay, so let's talk about what happens normally, okay? Normally, a muscle is going to take, in any cell, is going to take glucose, break it down, and first, I'm misspelling this horribly. Pyruvic. First, this should be somewhere familiar in your memory banks. You should be like, oh yeah, I remember pyruvic acid. Okay. This process is called glycolysis. Okay, and it happens in the cytoplasm. Then pyruvic acid moves into the mitochondria. And if oxygen is present, you make lots of ATP. Plus you make some carbon dioxide. Okay? But if there is no oxygen, you still take glucose, break it down into pyruvic acid. Sorry for the messy handwriting. You still do glycolysis, which gives you 2 ATP. And then you can't do cellular respiration. you take pyruvic acid and turn it into lactic acid plus carbon dioxide. And you only make 2, horrible handwriting there, sorry, 2 ATP. So at least you get some. Lactic acid, however, is still a large molecule with lots of energy. Where is the energy in these molecules? Does anybody remember where the energy is in a molecule? When I say glucose gets broken down, what do I mean? Okay, I'm talking about breaking down the chemical bonds, the covalent bonds that connect the carbons and the hydrogens and oxygens. There is stored potential energy in those chemical bonds. And I'm sure on this recording, you're going to be able to hear the whistling of the noise coming through. So anybody who isn't a student at Etiwanda, just so you know, we aren't in the middle of a hurricane and the classroom isn't going to take off. It's just the stupid ventilation system and it'll go away in a second. So anyways, if I was listening to this as a student, I'd be like, what is that noise? Yes, we get to deal with this every day, don't we, you guys? Yes. Okay, so because lactic acid is a large chemical, a large molecule, it has lots of covalent bonds. That means it still has lots of stored energy. So your body says, you know what, it's a waste to dump that lactic acid. I'd like to be able to break that lactic acid down and still make some more ATP. So what has to happen is, after you're done exercising, okay, your body has a chance to increase the oxygen levels in your cells. And this is called paying off the oxygen debt. Okay? The oxygen debt. And so what happens now is that lactic acid that you had, okay, we went from pyruvic to lactic. The lactic acid gets turned back into pyruvic acid, and then the pyruvic acid gets turned into ATP, CO2, and you get your 38, sorry, I messed that up. You get your 38 ATP, okay? Okay, so with oxygen, when oxygen is present, okay, you pay off the oxygen debt. Because that would be a lot of energy wasted if it were dumped. Okay? Does that sound familiar at all? Going way, way back, we're talking about lactic acid fermentation. What's the other type of fermentation? We had it going on in the bags in here. Alcoholic fermentation. Do our cells do that? Nope. Unfortunately, no. If our cells did alcoholic fermentation, do you know how jam-packed all of the exercise clubs would be?
Wait, why?
What's produced from alcoholic fermentation? Alcohol. You'd be making your own alcohol in your own body by exercising. We'd all be fit and drunk all the time.
Fit and drunk.
Right? That's where everybody would go on Friday night. They wouldn't go to happy hour. They'd go to the gym. There'd be flashing lights, disco ball. Doot, 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 doot. Everybody would be on the Stairmaster, working out, meeting people, getting their buzz on, right? Nope, it doesn't work that way. Sorry. What the? Okay. So, oxygen debt is the burning. So when we say burning, we're not talking about a fire inside of your cells. We're talking about breaking the chemical bonds down to break down that excess lactic acid to get as much energy as possible. Okay? So this is where we're going to stop for today. All right? You may be in the middle of page 74. You may have gone on to 76, but this is a nice little chunk of information. This was a 30-minute lecture. Okay, I'm going to put this up on our Google Classroom. Please, if you haven't already done so, like and subscribe my channel. Leave me comments on what you'd like me to do more and better. Okay? And until next time, bye.